Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Today, I've got for you an early Christmas present. Something not expected, something you may have been wanting. So sit back, relax, and get ready for my telling of Buried Secrets, Chapter 2. I had a stalker outside my house.
Buried Secrets, Chapter 2. I had a stalker outside my house. By L.W.Suton. When I was young, my parents made me move. I switched schools, changed houses and towns, and although we did not relocate far, it felt like a whole different world back then. The house was smaller, the yard more barren, and the surrounding forests had been replaced by fields of buckwheat, with tree lines only at their distant edges. I missed my friends, Heather and Jason, terribly. No one had yet found Heather, or found out what had happened to her, since that day that she disappeared. I felt bad for leaving Jason behind. It had been months since his sister had disappeared, but his apathetic and somewhat cold demeanor could make one believe the tragedy had only happened yesterday. Unfortunately, the choice was not mine to make, and I was forced to say goodbye. With a mind too heavy for what a child should have to carry, we drove away from my childhood home on a late Thursday afternoon, a place that held both many wonderful and calamitous memories. When I first entered that small house, the first thing I did was seek out what would be deemed my room. I quickly found my options limited. Aside from the larger master bedroom, there was only one other space suitable for a room to call my own, and it was small. In fact, the space was so limited, my parents had gotten me a bunk bed purely so my space to sleep wouldn't take up any precious floor space. The room itself was only 6 by 8, and I've met some people with larger closets. There was a single window on the wall opposite the door that lent a view of the grassy backyard and a sprawling buckwheat field beyond. The distance between homes was not lost on me either. I had not seen another house for at least a mile from the direction that we had traveled in from, and from where the house sat, I couldn't see a single residence in any direction. The only thing nearby of note was a small pond in which I could go fishing. Fishing is a solitary sport, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. The pond wasn't stocked with much, small bass and some panfish. Both the land and only standing structure to speak of seemed to be owned by frogs, even with the private property sign posted at the edge. Still, no one bothered me, and I imagine it was mostly there to keep people out of the collapsing structure that boasted the sign of an old cross-country ski lodge. I never planned on going in there anyway. I was there to fish. That all ended the day I caught maybe the only large fish out of that small body of water with my telescoping rod, and I rushed home to show my mother. However, in my haste, I forgot my pole, and despite my name being written on it, and never seeing a person at the place ever, it was gone the following day when I went back to retrieve it. That was the last day I went fishing for a very long time. Additionally, being before a time of the internet and mobile phones, staying in touch with my last remaining friend was near impossible, and making any new ones in this desolate location seemed equally unlikely. It wasn't long before I had my stuff unpacked and set up my small room. The limited space also limited my options for placing my things, and much of my belongings stayed in boxes in the small closet near to my bedroom. My parents would need a few more days than I to unpack and arrange their things, and my thoughts were beyond making this place my own. I laid in my elevated bed that night, listening to the sounds of crickets playing their songs in the field nearby, wishing only that I could simply just go home. The next few days and nights progressed as one might expect. Parents spent time setting up their new home how they liked it, and Dad ventured back and forth for his new job. I spent a lot of time in my room because there was nothing much to do outside. The summer days drew out long and boring, and the nights were always a bit unnerving feeling. I wasn't sure if it was the lack of the surrounding woodlands that I was used to, the quiet desolation, or a combination of the two, but when night would fall at the end of each day, I found myself anxious of the ensuing darkness. However, uneasiness of the witching hours was easily mitigated by the thought that my parents were right outside, on the other side of the wall from where I slept. That is, on the nights that they were home. My parents didn't go out much, and when they did, they would never spend the entire night away. However, what began as an hour out at the local diner together soon progressed into 2 hours out with some after-dinner ice cream. I think it was my showing them that I was a good kid that led to the circumstances that I was placed in. Each and every time they would come home, they would find their house still standing. No charred and half-burned rugs, no abundances of mess, no real catastrophes to deal with. In fact, they would usually return to find me sitting in my small bedroom watching movies on my 13-inch color TV, minding my own business, and subsequently not getting into any other trouble. Therefore, soon, their nights out included dancing at a local jazz club in a city nearby, returning well after the sun had set, and darkness had reigned supreme for at least a few hours. Those nights were some of the most terrifying nights of my entire childhood. That feeling of isolation and known helplessness that whatever malevolence might mean to do me harm. But still, even that was nothing as compared to when the noises started. I really wish I wasn't such a well-behaved child. I don't know when it had truly started, that night or possibly any other night before it, as whenever I was left in that house alone, the television was always on. The background noise seemed to combat the dread of isolation, holding back a surge of fear with a dam of audible concrete. But late one night, in the fraction of a moment between commercial and programming transition, and the briefest of silences allowed something else to penetrate my ears, muffled and obstructed by the exterior wall and the glass of my small bedroom window. Before I could identify the sound with any accuracy, however, the television show I'd been watching aired again, and the odd sound was once again drowned out. Of course, I stood next to my feet and turned down the volume on the television, allowing whatever that sound was to be heard, to once again make its presence known. I stood there, resolutely still with probing ears, listening to the sound of dead silence coming from the dark outside, surrounding the home. Not another soul supposedly around for at least a mile. And right when my thudding heart began to slow once more, just as I reached for the television to turn the volume back up, it happened again. There was the sound of an agonized and distant, whining howl, with a notable cadence that I did not yet understand, and it emanated from what sounded like a wounded animal from somewhere out in the wilderness. But the sound it made was so shrill and eerie, it put me on edge. I couldn't explain how, but I somehow felt it was calling out to me specifically, somehow knowing where I was, and getting louder as it got closer. To this day, I cannot truly pinpoint exactly what it was about this experience that terrified me to my core. There wasn't supposed to be much living anywhere near the house of any substantial size, human or animal alike. Most creatures residing in the surrounding fields being small mice and noiseless snakes. And it was night, a notably cold and moonless, dark night at that, and the abnormality of these circumstances coalesced into a situation that just felt terribly wrong. A deep paralysis caused by tremendous fear constricted me like a swaddling blanket, and although I knew that I should call one of the emergency contact numbers for help, I found myself far too scared to move an inch. I stood there nearly helpless, listening to something so strange and queer, screaming and with a sorrowful cry, becoming more detailed and detectable as whatever it was getting closer to the single-story farmhouse. At one point, I contemplated moving to the front door, opening it, and calling out in response to whoever or whatever this thing was. But in that same instant, headlights crept down that dark road outside the house and soon after turned into the driveway out front. I never thought I'd be so happy to see my parents return home. I assumed, of course, that my mom and dad would hear the calling as well, and therefore investigate. But as I sat there in the silence of my room, television muted, and awaiting a noise that may lend insight to what I was hearing, nothing happened, except for the eventual sound of the front door opening. I knew it was my parents. I had seen them pull in, but there was a sliver of grim doubt that maybe someone else had entered the home. I stood to my feet and poked my head out of the bedroom door, looking in the direction of the kitchen and the front door in the foyer to the right. And moments later, my mother emerged into the kitchen, followed by my father. Mom asked me how everything was, how things had gone, and I began explaining everything that happened, including the noise that I had heard outside. Mom and Dad looked at each other and then back at me with a smile, assuring me that I must have been simply hearing things. Dad did go outside to look around, putting my worried mind at ease, but after finding nothing of note, I was forced to at least consider my mother's explanation. I'd been alone in an isolated house, surrounded by darkness, watching scary films. It was conceivable that my mind did run away with me a bit, and maybe there was never anyone outside at all. This reassurance certainly put me at ease, and after a few days, I had all but forgotten about it. That is, until the next time my parents decided to have another night out. When they told me that following Friday that they would be going out together once again, leaving me at home by myself, the anxiety and dread of the previous weekend re-emerged, as if the panic had never actually left me. It really was like I had forgotten all about the incident, but as soon as I was privy to my parents leaving the house again, resigning me to a night alone in the middle of nowhere, isolated by geography and the impediments that come with such a young age, it was like my mind had placed me right back in that same situation, like I was reliving that night all over again. I felt my skin turn clammy, and I began to sweat. I assumed that my complexion had instantly been drained of color, because after my mother informed me of their plans, she immediately asked me if I felt okay, saying that I looked a bit pale. Now, maybe I should have told her the truth. Maybe I should have begged them not to go out. But I honestly felt as though I was likely worried about nothing, that they had been right to say that I had imagined it. And by making them stay home, I would be placing my unwarranted fears on them, unfairly interfering with their plans. So, against my better judgment, I told my mom that I felt fine, and that there was no need to worry, that I could handle another night alone in that house. As the rest of the day drew out, so did my fear, like an ominous pressure that exponentially increased until my parents had said their goodbyes and were out the door. And honestly, at first, the moment that they had pulled from the driveway, I felt that pressure leave me. No matter the odd instance, this wouldn't be my first night alone in the house, and really, the sound approaching the house really could have been imagined, or so I convinced myself. After making myself a small snack for one, I then entered the living room, turned on every light, and powered on the television. I can't remember what movie it was, but I know that as I watched it, I had all but forgotten that which had made me nervous all day, softened by my benign perceptions of the truth, unnoticing of the quickly darkening sky that had turned to a pitch black by the time the movie's credits rolled. It was the moment the movie was over, and I shut it off, that the fear came rushing back, like a tsunami of ominous dread, crashing into my consciousness full force, increasing tension levels dramatically in an instant, from at ease to utterly terrified with the click of a button. The sudden silence and the realization that it had gotten dark had solidified into one single notion. I was once again, truly and utterly alone. For a few minutes, my fear had gotten the better of me, refusing to allow myself to focus on anything else but the silence that came from the resolute darkness. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing happened, and although I still felt fearful and wary, I also began to settle on the sense that my situation was not as malevolent as originally considered. So I eventually put on another movie in the living room, slightly more at ease, still with every light in the house on, just in case. It was hours later when I heard a thud sound, and I assumed my parents must have been home. It was well after midnight, and they still never stayed out all night. I turned off my TV and retired back into my bedroom, rest assured that they had returned home. However, as I went to turn on my small 13-inch set, I paused and listened. I hadn't heard a second door shut, nor was I even sure that the sound I had heard was in fact a car door being closed. And as I waited, hoping to hear them coming up the wooden stairs to the front porch, it finally dawned on me. I hadn't seen any headlights pull in. Whatever that sound was, it couldn't have been my parents returning home. Now I was starting to visibly shake, terrified beyond any preconception of fear, plunged into what I could only label as my worst nightmare. I had no idea what to do next. I just stood there, listening, afraid to turn on the TV and block out any further noises that could prove useful in detecting. Afraid to leave the confines of my bedroom, and afraid to look out a window. As I stood there, gulping down my fear, I heard it. It was faint, but closer than the last time. It was an odd whining or beckoning sound, only now I could hear the cadence behind it. I think I stopped breathing, holding my breath, both hoping and fearing that I'd hear it again. And just as I had thought, it called out again, only this time, speaking two words so clearly, I couldn't believe my ears. "Help me." Who the hell could be outside my house, calling for my help at any considerable distance away? There wasn't a soul around for miles. Not even motorists frequented this route, and for the voice to sound so meek and pitched, it made even littler sense still. I was absolutely scared stiff, but I had to force myself to move from place, whoever this person was, they were calling for help, and their need for assistance sounded desperate. And right on cue, as I stepped from my bedroom, heart racing, I saw headlights enter the driveway outside. My parents were home. I thought for sure that they would hear the calling, but as I listened for the car doors to open and shut, I realized something else. There persisted the sounds of wind rustling branches and leaves, the sound of summer insects chirping their songs, but no more sounds of someone calling for help. And once again I noticed it. That's when I heard the doors shut on my parents' vehicle, and the sound of their shoes coming up the steps out front. When my parents came in the door that night, I rushed to greet them with a barrage of words and phrases that made no more sense than my unprecedented and panicked approach. My mother kept asking me to calm myself down, to speak slower, occasionally looking over her shoulder to give my father a look that showed her concern for my obvious distress. I finally told her about the sounds from a few nights ago, the calls for help that I had heard outside on that night, and my confusion of how or why someone would be outside, but they obviously needed help. It was at that my father rushed out the door to locate and possibly help this person. My mother walked me into the kitchen to sit me down and both calm my anxiety and gather any more information that she could. I didn't realize it then, but my mind was a blur with contrasting ideas and contradicting thoughts, trying somehow to add the variables up into a single understandable notion. But my father had been gone a while, and when he returned, I'll never forget what he told me after my mother begged him to spit it out, not thinking of me being in the room. And when he told her, I couldn't tell if it was myself shaking on my mother's lap, or if it was her lap shaking on its own. But I think maybe it was a bit of both. My father found an old, dirty man lurking outside the house, trying to hide within the tree line. He said he had been gone so long because he chased him through the field and then down the road. My mother asked him the same thing that I wanted to. What did he want? Dad said he didn't know, but that he got a good look at the guy and would be filing a report with the local police the following day. Over the weeks to come, I remembered thinking that they must have got the guy, because I never heard that man again, or saw him with my own eyes. But another thought stuck with me as well, something I was never able to shake loose. If it were an old man outside the house that night, calling for my attention with pleas for help, then how and why did he sound so much like a child?
Well, that's going to conclude Chapter 2 to my first novel, and if you would like to hear more, I encourage you to please check the link in the description and go check out the book. I'm sure that you'll find it to die for. But if it's more gore galore you crave, come back again next Saturday, and until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.
Social media can be very unpredictable, especially regarding horror content. If this content gets removed, all new content will be simultaneously presented on various websites provided in the description to this video. Make sure to follow me in other digital spaces so that you never miss out on the terror. Also, if you like this video, make sure to leave a comment and hit the like button. It helps the channel a lot. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy what's here, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you never miss an upload. Writing is a dream of mine, and it's all of you that make that dream come true.